In 1593, Juan Plata, a cleric in a convent in Puebla, Mexico, a man with mystical proclivities and a millenarian hope that Mexico was going to become the New Jerusalem, was especially troubled by the animosities that he saw around him and that threatened his dream of a unified Christian monarchy. And he warned about the results in apocalyptic terms. This is what he said. After the East and West Indies and Guinea, Africa, were discovered, the nations have become mixed, and they have not conformed or united with each other, as the prophet Daniel called for, as can be seen because they call each other Indian dog, or mulatto dog, or mestizo dog, and so they remain in discord amongst themselves, and thus we must await that which will come. Apocalyptic. The empires of Spain and Portugal had brought together by conquest, colonization, and conversion peoples of different cultures, ethnicities, and faiths, many of which were culturally and physically different. Because of their differences from Spanish and Portuguese cultural norms and practices, they were considered lesser, barbaric, or savage, or lacking in reason. How was difference going to be treated? What kind of society could be built around such diversity? In the history of medieval and early modern Spain and Portugal, there's no topic that has ever generated as much interest or more debate than that of the religious and ethnic plurality before the 16th century, and then the religious and ethnic exclusions thereafter, as Muslim and Jewish populations were by force or conversion, or by force or conviction, converted or expelled. At that same historical moment, as this dealing with internal others, these Iberian kingdoms were also involved in the beginnings of a maritime expansion with, and in some places in control of, a myriad of peoples of other cultures, of other faiths and ethnicities, and what we have now come to call other races. In the Americas, the inclusion of Native American peoples, Europeans, Africans, and some peoples from Asia, and the growth of neoteric populations of mixed origin born out of the sexual contact between all these groups, this produced a new and complex social hierarchy based on cultural, social, and physical characteristics. How that order came into being, how it changed over time, and how its principles of hierarchy, incorporation, and exclusion shifted from religious affiliation and ethnic origins or some moral or social deficiency to phenotype or race is the topic that I want to deal with in this talk this morning. Instead of concentrating, however, on Native American populations and on the large numbers of Africans, mostly brought as slaves to the Americas, as the best way to study the social hierarchy of Latin America, I'm going to try to do this by looking particularly at minorities, three minority categories of people: Moriscos, that is the converts from Islam; Conversos, the converts from Judaism; and mestizos, all of whose place in or exclusion from the societies of Spain and Portugal and their overseas colonies defined the peculiar ordering that distinguish Latin America. Today, I'm going to concentrate on the mestizos, but I hope to bring the other two minorities into the discussion as well. All of the European colonies either eliminated indigenous peoples or incorporated them as dependents or subject population. In a similar way, Africans came to all the European colonies, and everywhere they and their descendants, even when free, were there, they were placed at the bottom of the social ladder. Spain and Portugal shared in these experiences. But Spaniards and Portuguese also introduced a hierarchy based not only on ethnic or physical differences, but one that incorporated medieval concepts of orders and estates, medieval ideas about differences between nobles and commoners, the disparagement of manual labor, and the disparagement of illegitimacy at birth. And also included in this alignment, in this concept of social order, elements such as reason or religion that became central in their way of creating a social ranking. In Spain and Portugal, various categories and groups of people were at different times discriminated against and suffered disadvantages. One could mention gypsies, homosexuals, Protestants, just to mention a few. But particularly important in these discriminations were converts. Two kinds, particularly, of converts. The converts from Islam, the so-called Moriscos, and the converts from Judaism, the so-called conversos, or sometimes in Portugal, new Christians. The fact that even after their conversion, that they and their descendants were discriminated against, but not based not necessarily on what they did, but on who they were, this became a defining aspect in these societies. Essentially, a Christian society that had dedicated centuries to the conversion and assimilation of its religious minorities, when finally faced with success around the end of the 15th century, now imposed barriers to prevent that success. In a social regime defined by fixed corporate statuses, lineage, the transference of moral, ethical, physical, and personal qualities by blood or milk, a converso or morisco, no matter how sincere they were in their new faith, their Christianity, remained a fish out of water, an anomaly within the social order. They were hybrids. You might call them mestizos of faith. And as such, they constituted a danger. It was in their blood. The wife of an English ambassador to Portugal, Richard Fanshawe, reported being told in a Portuguese nunnery in the 1660s about a 14-year-old girl who had been taken from her imprisoned converso mother at birth and raised in the convent. She was burned as a Judaizante, a Judaizer, because despite knowing nothing of Judaism, she did daily scratch and whip the crucifixes and refused to adore that God, as the ambassador's wife said. In other words, it was in her blood. The existence of conversos and moriscos challenged a universe of clearly marked categories and of rankings. And as such, they were the precursors of the social instability created by persons of mixed race when color and phenotype replaced religion as the principal marker of social distinction. The practice and policy of using lineage and blood became the basic criteria for dealing with ethnic and cultural or religious alterity. And those same principles also shaped the social hierarchies of Latin America when sexual contact with the indigenous peoples and then with Africans began to produce populations of mixed heritage that quickly became a challenge to the existing social and juridical categories of an ordered and stable society. Now, of course, people of mixed parentage, mestizos or mamelucos as they were called in Brazil, or métis as they were called in French Canada, or half-breeds as they were called in what became the United States, they existed in all the American European colonies, but perhaps nowhere did their numbers or their importance equal that of the Iberian colonies. Here, an example from Brazil, from the mestiza and mulato. Mestizo was a term originally meaning simply the offspring of European and Indian unions, and it often implied illegitimacy as well. Over time, it was used generically to include the offspring of any mixed union, so that eventually it shaded into terms like casta in Spanish, especially in Spanish America, or pardo in Brazil, both of which had pejorative connotations because they included persons of African descent and thus implied servile or slave origins. Like the term morisco and converso, mestizo was a label that underlined genealogical thinking and the importance of lineage. And as such, it suggested the presence of mala sangre, bad blood, and the implied defects that bad blood was thought to transmit to anyone whose lineage included mixture with Africans, with heathens, with heretics, or with people of ignoble or birth or occupation. What made these three minorities so problematic was and particularly dangerous and destabilizing to society was the difficulty in distinguishing them physically from pure old Christian population of European descent. This image you see here is one of the few images I found of conversos, that is, former people descended from Jews or themselves having been converted from Judaism. And as you'll see in this photo, they're represented here like everybody else in 17th century Spain. They have no special badges or hats as Jews in the Middle Ages were portrayed in much Christian European art. And this was the particular danger about the converts. They looked like everybody else, and thus were particularly destabilizing. I think these the converts, the hybrids, are a particular key to understanding the role of race and other forms of social difference in the colonial regimes. Their capacity to evade limitations made by establishing social markers, laws, or institutional regulations, or a documentary paper trail of lineage and blood made them particularly dangerous. And what I hope to demonstrate is that in everyday practice, the restrictions that were put in place to hold them back were limited, modified, ignored, or evaded, not only by the intended targets, the converts, or the mestizos, but by other groups and individuals in society, sometimes even by the state or the church, because of pragmatic or financial or other kinds of considerations. The question is, how did this happen? But what underlines my talk today is still another question. These policies of exclusion in terms of religion, and codified after 1449 in the investigations of what was called limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood, which were supposed to certify that no heresy or no Christians in your, there was no heresy or no Christians in your family tree. That this idea of cleanliness of blood and its documentation created a new kind of genealogical nobility, a nobility of religion. And that this became part of the way in which the social boundaries were constructed. It privileged some people and disprivileged others. The question here is, was this or something like this racism? And thus are the origins of modern racism in the West to be found not in the 19th century scientific racism, as is usually written, but was it to be found here in Iberia and its colonies beginning in the late 15th and 16th century, if not even before? In 1492, when Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, finally fell to the Christian reconquest of Spain, Islam had become the quintessential enemy of Christian Spain. There was perhaps no better symbol of the continuity between the reconquest of Spain and the conquest of America than Santiago Matamoros, the patron saint of Spain, and the patron hero, really, of the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims, he was converted into Santiago Mata Indios in the New World as part of the conquest. The early chronicles of the conquest of the New World were filled with references to and comparisons between the Moros and the Indians, the Moors and the Indians, and with the programs and proposals to apply the methods of control and conversion that had been used with the former, the Moros, to be used for the integration and transformation of the Indians. Muslims, Jews, heretics, and those punished by the church, and those newly converted to the faith, were prohibited to migrate to the New World. But the policies and law were one thing, and reality was another. And so Moriscos, the converts from Islam, and conversos evaded the restrictions. They came also to America. The problem was that neither linguistically nor in appearance was it easy to discern the religious and ethnic background of the converts, and their forced assimilation had removed from them the old markers of turbans and veils and badges that had formerly made them identifiable. Thus, we have the explanation for the Inquisition's obsession with physical features like circumcision, or with habits like food preferences or bathing or other customs as a way that you could identify who was a descendant or a practitioner of those other, from people of those other faiths. The chance of their heretical contagion of the newly converted peoples of the Americas now became threatening, and thus there were these prohibitions. Distrust, dislike, and prejudice and the limpieza restrictions accompanied these internal others when they went to the New World, and served supposedly as an antidote to their presence. When the basis of their discrimination was supposedly religious, or while it was supposedly religious in the 16th century, despite some objections, a proto-racialist discourse about lineage and bad blood and transmitted an inherent faults of character or morality had already taken place or taken hold by the 16th century. And it served and would serve further as a precursor of how other groups would be considered. The cultural and biological mixture of peoples, or mestizaje, as it's called in Spanish, and the divisions that it created that so plagued the thought of Juan Plata, became a central issue in the creation of new categories of peoples in the Americas, and with them a new social order that marked a shift in distinctions based on religion and to distinctions based on color or phenotype. The process of mestizaje was never simply biological, so that social and historical circumstances always set the parameters of the categories of people and of their changing definitions over time. Who and what was a mestizo? Or who and what was a Spaniard, or an Indian, or Pardo? And what these categories implied was never fixed in time or place. They were unstable designations. That fluidity eventually became a matter of considerable confusion, but also of increasing concern by the 18th century as the boundaries of religious limpieza de sangre were augmented and to some extent replaced by a new terminology of what came to be known in Spanish America as the Sociedad de Castas, the caste society. The process of conquest and colonization created a myriad of new human categories and with purported affiliations of which biological and reproductive miscegenation, the mixing of blood, was really only one of the dimensions. Europeans sometimes went native, like this man. This is Gonzalo Gutierrez, who was a Spaniard who became a leader of the Indian resistance. There were other examples of Indian chieftains who sought Spanish coats of arms, of Indian commoners who dressed like Spaniards, or mestizos who avoided paying their tribute or taxes by pretending to be Creoles, that is, native-born Spaniards. There were many kinds of cultural passing that were going on, and all sorts of new statuses and definitions were created. Whole new colonial categories were created. Indian, for example, or Creole, or mestizo. These were new ways of thinking about people and grouping them together. And even the term like Spaniard acquired a different meaning in the New World, as anyone accepted as a member of the conquering class who shared certain cultural elements, and not necessarily someone who had been born in Spain. At first, there are few references to the progeny of Spanish and Indian sexual relations. People of mixed origin, or what were called mestizos. This was surely not because they didn't exist. The rapes and concubinage and formalized unions that you see represented here surely produced a generation of children of mixed origins. But there are remarkably few references to them in the surviving documents. Their absence is not a matter of reproduction, it's a matter of definition. The term mestizo existed, but it was not a term like blanco or negro or indio, that is, other descriptive terms that were determined by ethnicity or by color, but was in effect a negation of such categories. Mestizo was a term that had been emptied of its phenotypical significance, that over time it became a racial designation. Those terms were indications of casta, a word that implied purity of lineage, as we might speak in English about the breed of a thoroughbred horse. So the idea of a mixed race casta was in fact a contradiction and a challenge to the whole system of castas. And over time, it became associated with degradation and a taxonomic confusion that called for an imposed order. Like the concept of limpieza de sangre, colonial casta categories sought to create and maintain bounded social groupings, like the medieval's orders and estates. But they were continually subverted by a dynamic process of social class formation in which people of mixed origin or involved in ethnic passing played an increasingly important role. At first, the children of Spanish men and Indian women were accepted simply as Spanish, especially if they were legitimate. And even more importantly, they were accepted as Christians. Religion still defined status, and the father's Spanish blood trumped the mother's Indian milk. In Mexico and Peru, the children born of unions with indigenous noblewomen passed easily into the ranks of the Spaniards. But by the 1550s and 1560s, as their numbers increased, they were increasingly defined as mestizos, especially if they were of illegitimate birth. These people were valued at first for their ability to speak Indian languages and serve as go-betweens. Their biculturalism, however, also made them suspect and dangerous. They were feared because they knew too much about Spanish military arms and Spanish horses, and because they were thought of as being bellicose, mendacious, and malintentioned. And also, it was rumored or said that they joined the Indians in their drunkenness and in their heathen practices. Suggestions were made to send the mestizos back to Spain so they could learn a trade and become useful, or to put them in separate villages. Hispanic society, especially in the population centers, began to exclude them from positions of authority or clerical careers, although there were some exceptions because Rome could not find theological objections to their ordination. Although a few were upwardly mobile, and despite legislation could assume positions as even chieftains in Indian communities, often to the objections of the indigenous nobility, or were able to succeed in Hispanic society, the vast majority were increasingly pushed towards plebeian occupations in the countryside and in the cities. Their distinct status as children of Spaniards began to disappear. Some were able to pass into the ranks of locally born whites or Creoles, but in the long run, that also lowered the status of the Creoles themselves, And meanwhile, the acculturated Indians also began to escape their tribute paying out responsibilities by claiming to be mestizos. And so you can see there was a lot of passing between these categories that was going on. The context was changing. By the 1550s, however, the slave trade had also become regularized. And between that date and about 1640, over 750,000 Africans had arrived in Spanish America and Brazil. Sexual contact was now creating a new taxonomy of labels, and the Africanization of mestizaje that lowered its status. The increasing number of persons of African origins or of mixed parentage, which included African origins, negatively influenced the status of all persons of mixed origin and the process of mixing in general. As the numbers of what came to be called castas grew and the line separating the categories of peoples in the colonies broke down, the negative effect was to influence the status of all peoples born in the Americas. Conversos and Moriscos were a minuscule minority in the Iberian Americas, and they were clearly going to remain so. But the growing population of Creoles and peoples of mixed origin was another matter altogether. The realization that demographic reality is when the concept of limpieza de sangre, which was already present in the colonial world as a marker of religious and social status, was now reemployed and augmented, and increasingly applied also to the peoples of mixed origin or to the ethnic categories like negros that were considered to be without honor or purity. The American-born whites, the Creoles, were also affected. Negative views of American stars and climate and soils in the writings of peninsular natural historians led to an Indianization of the Creoles. It was thought that, you know, if you were born under the stars in the New World, you were lesser than if you had been born in Europe. And so the Creoles were thought to be more like and influenced by the Indians of the New World. And so there was a campaign to lower their status as well, vis-a-vis their peninsular opponents, because of the deficiencies of their blood, and because biologically, many of them were said to be really mestizos or Indians who were passing. Even if born of European parents, they were denigrated. And thus the Creoles became particularly sensitive in terms of their relationship to the people of mixed origin. They wanted to distinguish themselves and show that they were apart. This is the attempt to blur distinctions between them made them very sensitive about the perception of race. And that sensitivity led to an obsession of the American elites with to acquire markers and accoutrements of European nobility, titles and coats of arms, and memberships in the military orders of knighthood, and positions as secular participants or familiars of the Inquisition. All of these statuses, these things that they wanted that marked nobility, required purity of blood examinations and testimonials that could then be employed to establish the clean and noble lineage of the person involved. And this was a way in which the Creoles could set themselves apart from the rest of society. It showed that they did not have the stain of religion, of association with converts in their family heritage, nor did they have the stain of the mixed heritage of the casta, of the castas. They had claims to be clean and noble in their lineage, and that would set them apart within society. It's around these issues of nobility, religious purity, status, and class that the ties between limpieza de sangre and what would emerge in America as the ordering of phenotype, the Sociedad de Castas, it's in that relationship that they came together in the 18th century. The limpieza statutes were braided together with the concept of nobility and honor as a distinction between themselves and the commoners. Titles of nobility were relatively few, but many people could hope to at least achieve the rank of hidalgo, gentleman, which and the privileges and exemptions and honors that went with it. While these limpieza regulations were originally created to disadvantage conversos and had never become general laws, they were widely adopted by many institutions and organizations. And these restrictions applied to any other category of people who also, because of their status, were assumed to lack honor. Thus, people of plebeian origins, anybody of illegitimate birth, or anybody descending from a family of vile occupations, like tanners, were also considered to be of defective blood. By the late 16th century, it was common to see institutional regulations calling for purity of blood, language excluding somebody of illegitimate birth, mechanic occupations, Moors, Jews, converted persons, or mulattoes or negros, that is, racial categories. The last two categories now imply illegitimacy or servile contact, that is coming from somebody with slavery in the family tree. Noticeable here is the fact that what's being assessed by the restrictions is not fidelity to the church, but a faultless lineage. It didn't matter how faithful you were, you could still be characterized as dishonorable, because it was believed that the bad blood would inevitably lead you to disloyalty, betrayal, and apostasy, conditions associated with illegitimacy, with plebeian origins, and with the vile occupations, as well as with the converts. The judge and great legal scholar Juan Solórzano Pereira, these are images of the Limpieza de Sangre documents testifying to the purity of individuals. This is what the Creoles were seeking. And here, the book of Política Indiana of Juan Solórzano Pereira. In this book, he reflected the changing attitude towards mestizos and mulattoes. He argued that those born of legitimate unions should be fully accepted, but that the majority of them were illegitimate because so few honorable Spaniards would marry a Black or an Indian woman. And so their mixed race children were born, therefore, with a tendency toward vicious customs. And this is how they justified the application of the Limpieza de Sangre examinations to the people of mixed origin. From the beginning, the purity laws had met with stiff objections, both on theological and practical grounds. Some theologians asked seriously, how could the lineage of Christ and his mother, that is the Jewish lineage, be held to be dishonorable? Others argued that whatever Jewish honor had been obscured by deicide would be restored by baptism. Many argued that a Christian theology of exclusion was in fact flawed in conception. And even more than this, that the practical result would upset the existing order of society. Members of the Inquisition, some members of the Inquisition, even argued in 1626 that there were so many noble families in Spain that over the centuries had married with conversos, that now to exclude their descendants would only rob the country of its brightest and most distinguished members, and elevate and inflate the pretensions of commoners, who, while they might be all old Christians, that is pure, were often lacking in talent and accomplishments. The whole system of testimony and proof of limpieza had become so marked by forgery, graft, and corruption, or by its use to attack rivals and settle scores, that it had weakened the moral state of the country. But as the population of castas increased, the population of European origins became more and more insistent on limpieza, because while cuisine and dress and habits and language all mattered, ultimately lineage and religious purity remained the dominant criteria of status. By the second half of the 18th century, race rather than religious orthodoxy had emerged as the principal marker of the social divisions. The Creole elites, ever anxious to separate themselves from the plebe, now found in the Bourbon monarchy in the 18th century a more receptive response to their desire for noble status, a willingness to grant them noble titles for money, and even in some cases to remove the stain of illegitimacy or African origins for an appropriate payment. All of which was important to establish their limpieza de sangre and enable them to the privileges of honor and nobility. Throughout Latin America, but with considerable regional variation in terminology, a complex system and theory of classification developed, based on a theory of percentages of African, European, and Native American blood, but in reality, incorporating aspects of culture and language and degrees of conformity as well. A lot of debate has centered on the extent to which this system was an extension of the original ideas of limpieza, which was transferred from an association with religion to an association with lineage, color, and modern ideas about race, and the extent to which this system had already been transformed into a society of class divisions. The lack of congruence between a juridical order or a state or a ranking based on occupation or income or a hierarchy on color created a sense of social fluidity, of instability and insecurity. Shifting self-identifications to avoid military obligations or taxes or to gain advantages contributed to that insecurity. And as a bureaucrat in Guanajuato trying to enlist Spaniards for service in the military complained in 1796, he said, "The majority of common people in New Spain are of unclean castas, who mix with each other without concern about who they marry." And he added that so long as people could avoid having to pay tribute as an Indian, or the category of Negro, which suggested slave origins, that the different casta categories really mattered very little to people. Really, nothing illustrates the casta system better than illustrations of the castas, right? And these are the so-called casta paintings. This is a peculiarly American genre. There's nothing quite like them in Europe. Each painting displayed a man and a woman of a different racial type and their child or children, usually done in sets of 16 canvases, although a few from the late 18th century and early 19th century have all the categories on a single canvas, but in different panels, like this one that you see here. There are known to be about 100 of these sets, mostly painted in New Spain, that is Mexico. The earliest are dated 1711, but a great majority of them were painted between 1750 and 1780. The artistic quality varies greatly. Some were done by well-known and much commissioned artists, and others seem to be a kind of tradition of folk art or ex voto paintings. Many of the figures and scenes come from stock images and are repeated from one set to another. As an artistic corpus, they are a remarkably rich set of genre painting that give us a singular view of domesticity, material culture, apparel, gender relations, and child rearing. The labels, Spaniard and Indian produce mestizo, Black man and Indian woman produce zambo, etc., seem to be an attempt to examine the permutations of mestizaje in a broad sense, with the implicit objective of revealing how Spanish status can be retained or regained. The Casta paintings have been carefully and lovingly studied by many people, but as rich as they are, they leave a lot of questions. Why were they done? For what purpose? And for who? And did the Baroque mix of interracial combinations represent functional social groupings, or was this just kind of an artistic play with the possibilities of social organization in the New World? These are mysteries. The first series in the 1711 predates Linnaeus's classic work of natural history. But there seems to be some kind of classificatory purpose to the paintings and a relationship to the scientific gaze of the 18th century. A number of these sets and similar paintings of colonial types included New World fruits, like you see in this one. The bottom panel here shows avocados and other New World fruits. Right. And they're labeled and identified. At least one set was commissioned by Madrid's Real Gabinete de Historia Natural, that is a Natural History Society. But a large number of the sets suggest an additional non-institutional market for exotica and natural history. One set we know was commissioned by a viceroy of Mexico, and others were owned by high-level ecclesiastics. But in the main, the paintings are curiously secular. There are very few, or I'm sorry, no scenes of churches and scenes of devotion, and few religious objects are visible as personal items or as household decorations. Why that should be so, no one's ever really explained, especially if they're being commissioned by ecclesiastics. We might ask, who had the money to pay for a large canvas? 16 large canvases in a set, right? Right. They implied a large amount of money being spent on canvas and paints. And who had the space to hang these on their walls? Certainly the wealthy Creole merchants or hacienda owners or miners and Spanish bureaucrats that had the funds to do so did not decorate their salons with paintings of mulattoes and lobos. I believe that for the most part, these paintings do not reflect the preoccupation or fears of colonial society. There are no images of conversos in the sets. And the Moriscos that are included are not the descendants of converts from Islam, but Morisco became one of the categories for light-skinned mulattoes in the Casta system. I think that these paintings are exotica, that they are designed for export. They are a combination of natural history, taxonomy, and social commentary that were essentially souvenirs, postcards of empire. But even if that's true, it does not negate the concern that Latin American societies had with the proliferation of peoples of mixed lineage and the implications of cross-category unions. These depictions of social types and relationships seem to be more a representation of what could be called calidad in Spanish, quality in English, than of inherent racial characteristics, because the images often show lower-ranking castas portrayed positively in useful occupations as loving spouses and parents. And at the same time, they sometimes portray people, include people showing behaviors that are associated with particular of the castas. This is violence that being shown between husband and wife, right? And associated with particular of these castas. If the casta paintings have any underlying message, it's that the stain of blackness is difficult to overcome, and that there is always a possibility of regression away from the category of Spaniard. Colonial society was complicated by a lack of convergence between its various hierarchies, and that confusion opened the door to manipulation and instability. Lineage and blood still mattered. People still sought the certificates and official recognition that purity of blood gave you. And the crown even tried to regulate unequal marriages. But everyone realized that it was increasingly difficult to maintain a separation and exclusion based on blood. While upper-class Spaniards and much of the indigenous population relatively maintained high levels of endogamy, that is, they married each other, the rest of the population did not. Social interaction was common. Culture was shared, and daily existence drew people of different categories together as they made pragmatic choices about their personal lives and conditions without much concern about these racial labels of mixture. So just so long as they avoided the ones that implied paying tribute or previous association with slavery. Now, some scholars believe that this should be taken to mean that the system of castas really had little meaning in the lives of most people or in the operation of society. But I think that's an exaggeration. The continual appeals for honors and titles and offices and knighthoods that required limpieza and that could be then used to prove one had limpieza demonstrate that, like it or not, social position mattered, especially to those who had some chance for upward mobility. But there is also evidence that even to those who didn't have hope of advancement, they also could not ignore the system. People were constantly upgrading their status or that of their children. They did so in baptismal records and in marriage registers. There's one study of Valparaiso, Chile, in the 18th century that shows that 50% of the household heads that appear in 3 censuses over a 30-year period changed their racial classification at least once, and usually upward. So if these categories didn't matter, why did people need to change them? What is clear is that the categories of casta were porous, and in places like Puerto Rico, Colombia, and Buenos Aires, mestizos often disappeared. They disappeared into the Spanish population by simply claiming to be Spaniards. Pictorial representation of the casta divisions are lacking for many other areas of the New World, but the system of organization, social organization, was pretty much the same. Here's the final question. My feeling is that while the elements of modern racism, the idea of inheritable moral and ethical qualities and characteristics, the denigration of particular somatic types and ethnicities were certainly present in the regime of limpieza and the sistema de castas, they were always accompanied by concerns with honor and nobility, legitimacy, status, social orthodoxy, lineage, and that differed considerably from what emerged in the 19th century Europe as what we think of as racism. But like many social systems, the system of castas changed over time. And as for political and financial, and often for political and financial reasons, governments tended to make advancement easier. The privileged classes then turned increasingly away from those considerations of equality and more towards the considerations that we would call racial. By the beginning of the 19th century, the remnants of concern and symbolism about blood purity and honor still concerned the elite families. But the various mixes that the Spanish called castas and the Portuguese called pardos, who now constituted a major segment of the populations, and in some places in Latin America, the majority, they had become increasingly restive within the system. Many had never adopted their ascribed colonial corporate identity, and others no longer thought of themselves in terms of those racial categories. Elites may have simply thought of them as the mob, or the rale, or the plebe, but the political changes of the next decades at the beginning of the 19th century would enable these people to begin to think of themselves as the people. But even then, the shadows of limpieza would continue to define their lives, and in some ways still do. In this final image that you see here, the famous Mexican mural showing Father Hidalgo, the champion and initiator of the Mexican independence movement. And here he is surrounded by the castas of Mexico, people of these various mixes and of the various categories within the casta system. It's useful to remember that Father Hidalgo was a priest, was captured by the royalist forces, and as a priest, he was turned over for trial to ecclesiastical authorities. Amongst the charges against him was that of judaizantes, Judaizer, the traditional claim or accusation made against conversos. It was a charge that revealed that terms like moro or converso or Jew or Morisco had taken on a metaphorical meaning as enemies of the established order. By that time, however, the contested place in society of Moriscos and Conversos and the challenge of their hybridity had brought to the social order had now been long replaced by and surpassed by concern with the far more numerous plebeian masses of people of mixed ethnic origins. The people that one viceroy of New Spain had called the monster of many species that are the inferior castes. Thank you very much for your attention.